me today. My name is Laura Chavarria. I'm head of product here in Kodiak Hub. And today I have the pleasure to talk to you about the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Directive. What it is, how can we navigate through it, and more importantly, how can Kodiak help you to not only be compliant, but to see this as an opportunity to grow. So for today, we will be talking about the law itself. We will see a little bit about the importance of compliance in the business landscape of today, as well as an introduction of what is the CSDDD. We will compare the legislation against the CSRD because some of our customers have confused it a little bit. They think they are the same legislation. So I think it's important to mention the difference between both pieces of law. Then we will go into the interesting part, how to be compliant, what is the step-by-step guide. And we will talk especially for your supply chain and also a little bit of how to start, which is what we need to remember after this presentation. So, good. Let's talk a little bit about the importance of compliance in today's market. Companies are facing different requirements from their customers, different requirements from investors, and even their employees. 70% of consumers are actually motivated to purchase from companies that are committing to make the world a better place. It's not only about price and quality any longer. It's also about these standards of commitment of making the world a better place and not only about the price. And that's also true for investors. 73% of investors state that the efforts to improve environment and society contribute with investment decisions. And that's something that we have seen how it has changed in recent years, how more sustainability funds appear and how it is important for them to analyze not only the financial numbers, but also non-financial metrics. Another very important stakeholder is employees. 88% of employees believe that it's not acceptable to work for companies who make money at the expense of society at large. So that's another reason why we need to embed ESG core principles, practices in our companies. If we want to attract top talent, we need to make sure that they feel comfortable working in a company that has this type of principles. And that's precisely what we want to accomplish here in Kodiak Hub. We want to take our customers into this journey from not only risk management and compliance, but all the way to shareholder value. And the CSDDD, if done properly, if it's implemented in a way that it can bring value, not only compliance, it can help you shift the narrative in your company. And we're here to help you in that journey. So let's take a couple of cases. I think it's always important to learn from other companies. Some years ago, Boohoo, the British fashion brand, had one of their darkest hours when the NGO Labor Behind the Label and the Sunday Times revealed that there were some labor abuse issues in their supply chain, basically modern slavery allegations. When this happened, Boohoo's share prices dropped 50% within 9 days. And to add to the effect, many of the retailers who were selling Boohoo's clothing, like Amazon, Zalando, they actually suspended the sales of Boohoo's products. Something very similar happened to H&M. H&M had a scandal made public by the Financial Times when they realized that some of their packagings were made by political prisoners in China. As a difference with Boohoo, the share price for H&M remained steady. There were no investor reaction. the company continued working as normal. So here's where we want to ask ourselves, why did the modern slavery scandal impact Boohoo so much more severely than H&M? What was the difference between these two fashion companies that one was able to overcome it way faster than the other? And here it comes the process. H&M had a really robust human rights due diligence process already in place. It was an early adopter of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. As well, it has been always recognized by rankings, for example, the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark or the Fashion Transparency Index. It has always been recognized as a good company with good processes regarding human rights in their supply chain. Boohoo, on the other part, it was always criticized by this approach. It ranked the second lowest tier in the Fashion Transparency Index, and it was not even recognized or included by the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. So here the main difference was the process that these companies had at the moment of the scandal. H&M had a really good set of standards that enabled them to have a quick and very credible response. They actually came out and said that they will do an investigation, they will follow their processes, and if they find issues of modern slavery, they will terminate the contract with those suppliers. They were able to do this because they had the tools to investigate the suppliers to address those risks. So, of course, having this type of tools, having this type of processes made the company more resilient. It was easier for them to bounce back. And having all of those processes, having all of that data, helps with the recognition from different indexes, and of course, the investors can be a little bit more at peace. So here we want to actually ask you if you can tell us which is the solutions that you're using today to handle your due diligence. What are those tools that you're using? Because this is the key. This is truly the key on how you're going to handle one of those issues like Boohoo or H&M. I will give you some minutes here to see the answers. It seems that we have a couple of their more traditional solutions like Excel and Word, and also homegrown solutions. Yes, here is all the magic is truly about having, when everything is going well, having those processes implemented. So we truly do recommend to start thinking about it earlier. All right, let's continue a little bit more with the CSDDD, now focus on the legislation itself. The main piece is a directive, is a EU directive, so that means that every country has to now approve it and implement it under their own terms, which is a process that they're doing it right now. The main proposal aims to establish obligation for companies to identify, prevent, mitigate, and also being accountable for the adverse impacts that companies can have. The whole idea is to try to help companies to go and change their business model and make their strategies compatible with this transition that the EU has decided to take under the EU Green Deal and also the Paris Agreement. So it has a very strong focus as well in climate change and 1.5 limit, which we are all in the same boat for. The CSDDD has three different dimensions. First, we have the operations. That's internally your company. What are you doing? How are you handling your ESG practices and indicators? So that's the easy part because you can control. It also has a focus on subsidiaries. So the CSDDD is requesting to do the due diligence at group level, cannot be my company and my daughters are separate. It has to be the mother and the daughter companies in one report. And of course, your supply chain. So this is 3 different ways. Everything that is internal that you can control is easier to manage. Supply chain is when you start struggling a bit, because the data that you need, the actions that you need are with your suppliers. So you need to have a really good relationship with them. You need to focus on collaborating, working with them, so you can respond to this legislation. For the scope, this was one of the biggest changes that the European Commission did for this legislation. It used to be for smaller companies. Now it's for larger companies with employees over 1,000 employees and a turnover of 450 million. As I just mentioned, the law has a focus on group companies and mother-daughter companies. So any parent company who has a group meeting 450 million, they're also part of this legislation. And companies with licensing or franchising agreements with royalties above 22 million are also included, along with a network of 80 million. Finally, something that is also important to know for any company who might not be European but is working in the European market. If a company has, again, over 450 million euros of turnover last year, they need to meet, they are included in the CSDDD. So it's big companies. Something that is important to remember is that even if the scope of these companies is large, smaller companies, all of those suppliers, will be also affected by the legislation. So we all need to be prepared. If one of your customers is one of these large companies, they will come with requests, and you need to prepare yourself to make sure that you are that preferred supplier as well. Let's talk about the why, and this is something that I always like when there's a new legislation to read those first chapters about the reason behind it, because it will put a lot into context. Why is this legislation being promoted? What are we doing here? And in the case of the CSDDD, it's all about responsibility. The EU economy has a connection with millions of workers all over the world, with communities, with smaller companies. And according to the law, the EU is responsible for those relationships. So it has a strong focus on that. It has a strong focus on the fact that the EU has a very complex network of their supply chain. So it's very complex, it's not direct. So the legislation is trying to make sure that these companies are identifying and mitigating the risks in that chain overall. Additionally to that, of course, it has a very strong focus on human rights and how we can protect not only the workers, but also the communities where these companies are set, both for internal operations, but also suppliers. Something that you might not see in a lot of the promotional material for the law is that actually also includes health and safety. It is not only focused in human rights and labor rights, but also the health and safety. How are this equipment and so on? So that's something very important to remember when we're implementing the law. Of course, environmental impact is a big topic in the legislation. It's not only climate change. This is important. Of course, there's a special importance on climate change, but it's also about pollution of air, soil, water, biodiversity loss, overall ecosystem degradation. So let's talk about the CSRD now and why is it being put in the same bucket. Both of the legislations are being handled by the Commission at the same time. The market is preparing for both of them, but they are not the same thing. They're actually quite different. Their scope is different. Their content is different. CSRD is all about reporting. How we should report is actually not a directive as its own, it's an amendment for the non-financial reporting directive. It's designed this way because investors wanted to have a more standardized way to analyze ESG data in their due diligence processes for investing. So that's the nature of the CSRD. The CSDDD, on the other hand, is all about liability and obligations, how companies need to be responsible for their operations and their supply chain. And that it comes from a set of other legislations overall. That's to say, many of the actions and procedures and techniques and practices that you need for the CSRD, you will also need them for the CSDDD. So there's a lot of overlap. It is important that when your companies, if they fall in the both buckets, that you coordinate the implementation of this. But they're not the same. So it's important to know that there's also differences that you need to report. The objective at the CSDDD is all about this due diligence. The CSRD is focused on standardization. Everything is about those numbers, how you're going to report, and what areas do you need to report. For the scope is one of the biggest difference between the CSRD and the CSDDD. For the CSDDD is for larger companies. So companies, as you saw, with 1,000 employees and so on. The CSRD is for larger companies as well, of course, but also small and medium enterprises. So the only companies who are completely out of the legislation is these micro enterprises that are not included there. Talking about the content, CSRD gives a set of rules under another legislation, which is the ESRS, on how to report. So you need to conduct some assessments and some, it's called the double materiality assessment, some processes to define what do you need to do on the reporting and what do you need to report. The CSDDD, on the other hand, focuses only on identifying, assessing, acting, and monitoring. They don't give you a set of standards on how to report or how to do it. It's more about the obligation that companies have to identify those risks. So again, very different focus, some overlap in the content. For the implementation, truly the CSDDD is all about this legal framework that hold companies accountable. So it gives more power to the governments to go and chase and see what companies are doing, audit companies, try to make them fall into line. So that's what, of course, we want to avoid. That's the implementation for the CSDDD. The CSRD, on the other hand, that is for, again, financial institutions. That's the focus of this legislation. It was for them to be able to have standardized numbers to evaluate when they want to invest. So very different focus. So now let's go to the fun part, the step-by-step guide of how to be compliant for the CSDDD. We're going to focus on the law itself, Articles 4 to 7. This includes everything that you need to do to be compliant, and it is come from the law itself. After that, we will focus only in the supply chain. How are we going to do just for our suppliers? So let's start with the overall law. The first step that the legislation is requesting is the policies and the risk management system. How you're going to run those policies, what they're going to contain, and what is the importance of them. The second step is all about identifying risks or potential and current impacts and assessing how big those risks are, how severe those impacts are. Then we have what it is the preventive and mitigating actions that we want to have. This is very important. The law states that it's not only about eliminating the current impacts, it's also about preventing what can happen. So please take that into consideration. We have seen companies come with only focus on correction. Let's prevent first. Of course, if there are current impacts, that the next step is to minimize the severity of them and remove them altogether. The next step is what the law calls a compliance mechanism. Here in Sweden is very famous for the whistleblowing system. So it's these tools that any stakeholder, it might be a worker, it might be a member of the community, can use to do a report of a violation of the CSDDD. Finally, we have my favorite step, because here's where we know if what we're doing is having results, is the performance. And that the law, again, is very explicit about it. Measuring the right KPIs, measuring the right indicators to know if the practices that we have, if the policies that we have, having an effect on the company, on the overall supply chain as well. There's an overall arc of transparency and communication. Of course, this legislation also requests companies to be transparent in the information that they give to the public, and also they request an annual reporting. But let's go one step at a time and dig a little bit deeper into this. First, we have the due diligence policies, what they need to contain. I have to say this is, for me, one of the most important steps, because these are the rules of the game. We need to focus and make the policies extremely detailed, very clear for every stakeholder to know, because this is what it will allow you to continue developing this process. The law also states that they have to be updated every 24 months at least, or when there's a significant change. The policies must contain the adverse impacts that have been identified, and also which measures have been taken or will be taken. So let's talk a little bit about the content of those policies. The first thing is a description of the company's long-term approach to due diligence. So again, the rules of the game. How is the company going to do this? Then we have a code of conduct outlining the rules and principles for the company, the subsidiaries, or the group business partners as well. And how is going to be the process of implementing those practices, those rules. How are you going to do it? So this is why the policies are so important documents, because it's your blueprint of how you're going to do this. Once the policy is done, of course, you can change it. You should change it periodically when you learn and you want to improve things. But it is important to define it very well at the beginning so you can follow through that specific period. Then we start identifying and assessing the adverse impacts. You will have two types of impacts. The ones who are potential, they haven't happened yet, but they might happen. And the ones that are current, which are the ones who are happening right now and we need to stop. Once you identify those two types, the potential and the current, you need to measure the severity, how severe are for the current, and also how likelihood are for the potential. You need to engage with the stakeholders. Go and talk with the managers, the suppliers, go talk with the communities. And these things change over time. Practices change over time, indicators change over time. So identifying and assessing those risks is not something that you can do once. It's something that you need to go, it's a process, a continuous process of improvement. So you need to have a really evolved system to capture that information from different ways. Then we have the prioritization of those impacts. Which ones are the most severe? which ones are the most likely to happen if they haven't happened already. The law has a principle called sequential addressing. It means that you don't have to go and address every single impact at the same time. You can focus first on the most severe impacts and then start going in the chain. This is extremely important because companies truly do feel overwhelmed with these legislations. So it's important to know that we can focus first on the most severe impacts, the most egregious impacts, and then move forward in both in your company, but also in the supply chain. Then we come with the prevention and mitigation of potential impacts. This is what we call PAP. They're very similar to the next step, which is corrective. But as I mentioned before, I want to do a very strong focus on prevention. It is better to invest before that a risk has happened because it's cheaper, it's easier to manage, and we don't have the impact. So developing those preventive action plans, especially for the most severe risks or the ones who are more likely to happen, can help you to set up already contractual assurance, for example, for business partners, so you know how to respond if something happens. And of course, it will help you to minimize the impact overall. Nonetheless, if those impacts are already there, if they are current, you need to implement a corrective action plan. And here, of course, we want to focus is the first thing that we need to address, especially if they're very severe, is a lot of collaboration, especially if this is something that happens along your supply chain or in a community with external partners. So it's a lot of focus on how to do it, how to document it as well, and how to give support for those remedy processes. Everything that you do, both for the preventive action plan, but also for the corrective action plan, I will argue that is more important for the corrective action plan, must be documented. You don't want to have a whole project with a lot of effort and lose that documentation because the auditor will not see it. So have a system, please, that makes sure that you capture that information and you will not lose it in the amount of documentation that this type of legislation requests. Then we have the complaint mechanism, the whistleblowing mechanism. Here, the law gives you a sub-process about what it should be or how it should be. A complaint mechanism should be accessible, transparent. It should be enabled for any stakeholder. They should have access and transparency. So let's say if you're working with a global supply chain, it has to be able to send those requests in the language of the place. It should be able to handle the complaints in a prompt way, fair, impartial as well. It has to have protection measurements. We need to assure that there's anonymity of the person who is reporting. And you must assure that there's going to be a follow-up. You're going to investigate, you're going to do a remedy, you're going to do the correction actions. Again, documentation, and then communicate with those stakeholders what was the result of their report. So it's like a little bit of a sub-process that companies must have. This is more for your operations subsidiaries when they need to have the whistleblowing system in place. And then we have the performance of policies. As I mentioned before, this is, I think, the most important step of all, because we don't want to invest so much time and money and effort on all these processes and corrective action plans and then not have the results. So having the right indicators, defining which are the KPIs that we want to have, and have a robust system to implement them is extremely important. It is knowing the outcome of your practices. There is a very famous phrase, you cannot manage what you cannot measure, and here's where you measure the results of those practices. Last but not least, as I mentioned before, the legislation has an overall arc on transparency and communication. So there is a focus on public reporting. Companies must have an annual report. This information also must be accessible to the public, and it has to have all of the metrics in a very understandable way, not only the numbers, but also the impacts that you have identified, and more importantly, which measures have you taken. The legislation also mentions that there's a stakeholder engagement. So you need to talk with other communities, you need to talk with your employees, and of course, you need to talk with your suppliers and communicate that to them. Something that I wanted to add here, and this is important not only for the CSRD, it's important for every management system that you have, is leadership involvement. These type of processes take time, effort, and money. And the company must demonstrate they are giving employees the time, giving the employees the budget to follow up and to implement this legislation. So this is very important. I will argue that in your government system, someone from top leadership should be involved in these processes, in the day-to-day as well. Maybe not in the implementation itself, but you should be aware of every stage and the impacts that you have found and the measures that you have taken. Now let's focus on the supply chain itself. What is the process for your suppliers? As I mentioned at the beginning, operate your own operations and your own subsidiaries. That's the easy part because you can control it. You know the data, you know where it is. The supply chain is the most challenging area. So we're going to take you for a step-by-step approach, very focused on the law as well. I will not demonstrate the platform today, so please, you can book a demo if you want to see the CSDDD in action in our platform. So make sure that you tell the representative that you want to see how the process is, and we will give you a demo based on this legislation. Perfect. So let's start here with the first step. So before it was all about creating policies and how we're going to do those policies. For your supplier, it's about developing your supplier code of conduct or policy and how you're going to communicate that code of conduct. I cannot stress how important suppliers' code of conduct are. The policy is, again, the rules of the game. So it allows the supplier to know what you're expecting of them and also know how they should behave or what practices they need to implement. Many of our customers, what they do, and this is what I recommend, is to capture your code of conduct. You can send it to the supplier in a very easy way. You can do a mass send out. You can also request to the supplier to sign the code of conduct, which is, of course, a layer of legitimacy, of legality that can provide you security. Some of our customers know that their suppliers might not want to sign their code of conduct, and in that case, they request their own code of conduct as long as they have the CSDDD. Of course, if you have supply chains for 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 suppliers, capturing all of those documentations can be haunting. So you need to have a system like Kodiak that it allows to both communicate, send information to all your suppliers, but also capture information back. And more importantly, having the proof and having the receipts that you did this in case of an audit. Something that I really recommend in code of conduct and policies is to include a mechanism in case if the supplier violates CSDDD principle. Maybe they have a human rights violation, environmental degradation without any restriction. You should add a clause, both in the code of conduct or in the contract, that states that you can terminate the commercial relationship. And this is something that the law also states. I think that was the magic of H&M, that they had a mechanism and they can say to the public, if this is true, we will end the relationship with the supplier. So it's truly important to have it there, and that the suppliers know that this can be the consequence of a violation. The second step is supplier risk assessment, and here is all about identifying the risks, right? Risk can be defined as vulnerability. How bad are those processes? How unlikely are the supplier to bounce back? The likelihood of an impact to occur, and the impact, the severity of the impact itself. So it's not only about sending assessments to the suppliers, also about assessing what data you know about the supplier before. One of the most important analyses that you can do at the beginning of this process is the country. We know that there's something called systematic risk. It's how the supplier is in their ecosystem. That says a lot about the supplier. It is more likely for a supplier to have a human rights violation in a country without the assurances that a country from, for example, Europe, who has a lot of governmental assurances regarding human rights. So that can be your first step, how to evaluate the suppliers based in their countries. And it allows you to focus on the ones who have the more likelihood or the more impact based on their systematic risk. We have a module with 39 indicators that can help you with this, but very easily just to see is like, okay, these are my suppliers with the highest probability of human rights violations based in their country of providence. You also can check news outlets, make sure that everything is being monitored. Of course, the internet is a very big place, so it's not an easy Google search. For that, we have a specific module, Media Insight, that has very strict filters that can help you look for those specific news outlets that can help you say what the supplier is doing. And of course, sanctions. Sanctions are a great way to know, because you should never have a relationship with a supplier that has a sanction in place, depending on the country, of course, and the context. We also have a module, Trade Trust, that will very easily allow you to search up to for those sanctions. It also lets you know some indicators that the suppliers might have some not the best business ethics. So it will allow you to know if it's a special interest entity, if there's a political exposed person. Very easy. These type of investigations can take a long time if you don't have a process and a system in place like Kodiak. So for example, if you want to analyze systematic risk and today you don't have that possibility, you will have to go into those 39 indicators, look for the right numbers, process the numbers. They're all in different units, and that takes a lot of time, especially if your supply chain is quite large. So we recommend to have a system in place, a system with indicators like Kodiak, to make it easier. The same is with news outlets and sanctions. Then we have the supplier segmentation, which is something that is, I always say you cannot eat the elephant in one bite. You need to eat it in small pieces. So that's actually a very important step. How do you segment your suppliers? In Kodiak, you can do it manually. You can also do it automatically. You can set up a set of rules, and it will allow you to know which of those suppliers are in high risk and you need to address it right now. Once more, the assessment, the supplier self-assessment, make sure that you have a module, which is in our case called Insight, that it will allow you to capture all of that information. Here, the important part is to have the ownership of those assessments. Each company, each industry, and I will argue each category has their own impacts, they have their own risks and own opportunities. So make sure that, for example, we have over 1,000 attribute questions that you can use in your assessments, but we also give our customers the possibility to do their own questions. And that way you are safe that you will capture the data that you need to manage your risk and opportunities. That's extremely important. We cannot, for this, the nature of this law, we cannot go into the surface. You need to explore your risks, your specific risks, and how they're being affected by your supply chain. Then we always recommend to do audits for those critical and high-risk suppliers. You might have some suppliers that are high risk with a high likelihood of being affected by an impact that you want to go and visit because it might be critical for your supply chains. You cannot change it very easily. So audits are a great tool. It also is a really good tool for supplier engagement and collaboration. And of course, consider the adversity and likelihood of those impacts. All rating schemes they're customizable to your needs. They're based on a weighted average. So you can basically say what is more important for my company, and that will allow you to have a quick overview of which are the suppliers who have the worst practices, the worst vulnerability, and the most likelihood of impact. Then we have the prioritization of the identified impacts. This, of course, will depend on your supply chains, how it is, their global distribution, as well as your overall industry. What are the areas that are more important to you? Please remember about the sequential addressing. You can focus on the most severe impacts and then go beyond. The law actually says it can be done in a reasonable time. So it's not that we have forever, but we can go one step at a time. Then we have the preventive actions. This works very much the same as you will have internally. You identify the risk, you set the risk potential, and you collaborate with the suppliers. What is the big difference here? Is an external stakeholder, someone that is not in your company. So you need to have an interaction with them. Again, develop that relationship. And it's all about documentation, all about centralization. You don't want to lose how that preventive action measure came along. So if you have booked a demo, please make sure to check our actions module, because you will see how easy it is to capture all the information there and guide the user, in this case, the supplier, on how to do the preventive action. Same goes with the corrective action plan. And these ones are the most important. Remember, these are the ones who you need to remedy because it's something that is happening right now. So they have to be very timely. As soon as you identify the current impact, it must be addressed. Once more, documentation, and centralize the evidence that this has been fixed in one place. This is what the auditor will come to see, right? Oh, you had a risk or you have an impact. How did you handle it? And then, of course, you need to have the data on reporting. How many of these actions were closed? How many of these actions are still ongoing? How many of the suppliers have been involved? I mean, which type of actions it might be that you want to, you say, I have 100 suppliers with 5 health and safety actions and so on. So that's very important to have as well, this information, because it's part of what the legislation is asking to report, which are the measurements taken. Then we have the whistleblowing system. As I mentioned before, this is more relevant for employees and so on, but it's important to involve suppliers as well. It's important to communicate to the suppliers how your whistleblowing system is and how you can train them to use it, and make sure as well that they have their own whistleblowing system. I will argue that that's more important, to make sure that the supplier has their own whistleblowing procedure. What's more, my favorite part of the whole process, measuring your KPIs, making sure that your hard effort is paying, is having results and having important results. After you evaluate the performance, you can always go and do a corrective action plan as well, or a preventive action plan. Let's say that you have a carbon footprint indicator and you're seeing that your suppliers are not going in the direction that we want, you can go and do a follow-up. This is truly valuable to basically know that the effort that we have made is working. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we are looking for minimizing risk, of course, but it's not only about that. This could be an opportunity for taking your company to the other side, to have your company on the stakeholder value. And here is where you will be able to measure that. Here's where you will be able to know how to take and how long do you need to take your suppliers with you. So again, strong focus on KPIs. I can assure you that it will pay off because you cannot manage, you cannot measure. So that's what I brought you for today. I want to have one last slide about first steps. How should we start now that this legislation is relatively new? It has been, the implementation has been spread out in different buckets, so we still have time for most companies. So let's review a little bit about the first steps. What can we do today? The first thing, policies. Let's establish a supplier code of conduct that tells your suppliers what to do, what you want to accomplish, and remember that clause about terminating the relationship if they have a violation regarding this legislation. Then we have about segment your suppliers, and you can always segment your suppliers based on risk. So that helps you with the risk assessment. Assess the vulnerability. How well are those practices? How much is that country be affecting that supplier? As well as the likelihood of occurrence. Which are the suppliers that might be in a more risky industry, also in a more risky country? And of course, remember about the severity of impact. To give you a very clear example, a human rights violation regarding child labor or forced labor will have way more impact than a higher carbon footprint in your business overall. So that's what we mean with defining the risk. After that, you can prioritize your critical suppliers. Remember about the sequential addressing. You don't need to assess all of your suppliers at once or address them, but you need to address those critical ones first. To do that, you need to segment your suppliers and analyze how you're going to define what is a risky supplier for you. Remember that you can request information and you can always reclassify the suppliers depending on this. Good practices should reduce the vulnerability. And here is what our customers ask. But how can I do this if I have over 1,000 suppliers? It's all about defining the acceptance criteria before and using our rating schemes to be able to quickly analyze which of the suppliers have better practices and which ones have changed. Finally, address the preventive actions, address the corrective actions, make sure that you're documenting everything. And when you are maybe at the end of the process or you are collaborating with a couple of suppliers, go to your next segment and start again. And then this is a continuous improvement process. So this is what I brought for you today. Let me check the questions. I have noticed there's a couple of questions. Let's see. If a supplier won't fix the advertising spec, is it mandatory to end commercial relations or we can sign off the risk? That's actually a really good question. It depends on the risk. Let's put it that way. It's not like it's mandatory, but you might receive a corrective action plan from the government about that specific supplier. It's truly depending. I will not recommend to continue a relationship with a supplier that has clear violations of human rights, for example. That's the type of things that I think is important just to completely cut from your supply chain, but others, they can be working. The most important thing is to demonstrate to the auditor of the law that you are working with the supplier to do that. Even if the supplier refuses, you have a process to address it. You have a clause in your contract to address it. I believe is the way to go. But of course, it depends. It's truly depending on which are the impacts. I hope that answers your question. Let's see the next one. We have, may vulnerability, livelihood, and impact are measured on the same scale. Actually, this is something that is even a little bit controversial when you talk about risk management, vulnerability, livelihood, and impact. The way you measure this is called a Leopold matrix, and it's defined by you. What is vulnerability? What is livelihood? What is impact? Why is it defined by the company itself or the person who is doing the risk assessment? It is because it depends on the nature and the scope of your risk management system. So to give you an example, if you have a food company, the impact of using a non-approved additive in your supply, in your product, is way more severe, or the impact is way more severe if you have, I don't know, a flour company, because the impact is completely different because of the nature of it. So when we have done these exercises, you can have your own scale, you can define what it means to be vulnerable. My recommendation, it will be to define it for your supply chains, very similar to how you do your operations. What is impact, what is livelihood, and what is vulnerability? How are you going to improve the vulnerability? That's the most important part. And how you're going to reduce the livelihood and the impact. For impact, everything is about preventive measurements, right? I'm going to do this to avoid this. I'm going to implement safe railings to avoid an accident in the floor plant. I'm going to ask the supplier to change an additive from one to another to reduce the impact of the environment. So it's truly depending. They should be measured on the same scale, though, for the matrix to make sense. Mm-hmm. I hope that answered your question, Charles. To continue here, let's see. The companies are moving towards adoption of blockchain. They're facing the issues of ensuring the traceability and transparency. Data and figures are not available. The lower tier suppliers, social farmers, tier 2, may not want to share data due to ethical issues. That's very true. That's I believe, the challenge of our times. These legislations, unfortunately, I don't think they recognize how challenging that is. But you can always demonstrate that you have a process and that you're working with those suppliers. And that's the important part. The legislation is not focusing on the result. They're focusing on the process that you have to capture this information. For example, the CSRD, they actually mentions that they know that supplier lower tiers is pretty much an impossible task at this moment. So they allow to have some provisions with proxies and data estimations. What we need to have is an extremely close relationship with our first tier suppliers, because those are the ones who give us the goods every day, the services every day, and try to implement a culture for the second tier suppliers with those suppliers. So all about tier management is about the relationship that you have with them, making sure that they're growing with you. Changing a supplier is not an easy task. I'm sure that you have this very clear in your organizations. It is extremely important to foster these relationships so we can start capturing that data. And also, something that many companies do not talk about is supplier training. Because Amnat has a really good point. They might not want to share data. Some of them might be ethical issues. Some of them might not have that data. So it is important, if you have a critical supplier, a critical part of your supply chain, to train those suppliers on how to capture the data, how to remedy those ethical issues. I hope that was an answer to your question. Let's see here. How can international brands trace their supply chains, especially for lower tiers? In developing economies, consider ethical issues such as many parties and bribery issues. Yes, as I mentioned before, this is actually a really big challenge. It all comes down to supply chain relationship. How is your relationship with your first suppliers, with your first tier suppliers? How is their own systems of resilience? Because it's easier for them to work with their suppliers to improve those ethics. So you see, it's a little bit of a ladder. I recommend to focus on those direct suppliers. How is that relationship? What are we doing with them? How is their own supply chain? And this is why supply chain management is one of our rating areas. We need to evaluate our suppliers on their suppliers. And then we need to start collaborating on their goal. Developing economies, I do have to say, is especially for agriculture, goods, raw materials. There are also metals, cobalt in Congo. There's a lot of industries that present high risk. And this is why a module like SafeSource, this indicator of countries that allows you to evaluate that systematic risk, is so valuable, because you have that proxy. You know, okay, I have a supplier in tier 2 or tier 3 that is in a high risk country. How can we handle this? What are the practices? What are my suppliers doing to mitigate that risk? So that's, I think, the key part. But it is quite a complex topic to handle. I hope that answered your question. Let's see, I think this is the last one. Do you have standard templates for reporting sustainability initiatives from companies? We do. We have a library of over 1,000 questions that you can choose. We also have a standard templates that we can provide to our customers upon request, depending on sustainability initiatives. They're really good for the initial survey for the supplier. What are the main practices? What are the main risks? For more deep dives, as I mentioned before, it's all about your own risks, own your own systems. So I believe it is also quite important to you have that governance on the questions that you want to ask, because if not, everything that is on the surface follows through. So we can also help you with that. Our CS team, or customer success team, has a really good expertise. They have learned from the best practices of other customers as well to help you navigate, especially with this type of legislations. And I'm sure that we can work with you for a specific template or assessment for your industry, which will be also valuable there. Good. I think our time together has run out. We have the presentation here, the handout. So please, if you want to receive this PDF, just download it there. Let me know if you have any questions in the following days. I hope to see you soon. And I hope that you enjoy the CSDDD. Please remember to book that demo as well, if you want to check out Kodiak in action for the CSDDD and other topics as well.